The ontological argument. The ontological argument is an a priori, analytical and deductive in its nature. The first argument we will be discussing is Anselm's first argument. He was alive from 1033 to 1109 AD, and the summary of his argument goes as follows. Number 1. God is a being than which none greater can be imagined. Number 2. God exists as an idea in the mind. Number 3. A being that exists as an idea in the mind and in reality is greater than a being that exists only as an idea in the mind. 4. Thus, if God exists only as an idea in the mind, then we can imagine something that is greater than God. 5. But we cannot imagine something that is greater than God, for it is a contradiction to suppose that we can imagine being greater than the greatest possible being that can be imagined. 6. Therefore, God exists. In response to this, a monk called Gornillo challenged Anselm's argument with reduction ad absurdum. He argued that the perfect island must exist, for if it did not, then it would be possible to conceive of an island greater than the island which no greater can be conceived. A perfect island existing just because we conceive it in our head is absurd. Gornillo uses the same logical form as Anselm's argument to show that just because you can define a greatest possible being does not mean it has to exist. Anselm responds in his second argument, which states 1. God is that which nothing greater can be conceived. 2. It is greater to be a necessary being than a contingent being. 3. If God exists only as a contingent being, he can be thought of as to not exist. 4. A greater being could therefore be conceived. And 5. God must therefore be a necessary being. In further support of the ontological argument, René Descartes was a rationalist who presented two ideas, the theory of innate ideas and the belief in clear and distinct perception. First stage, 1. I exist. 2. In my mind I have the concept of a perfect being. 3. As I am imperfect, I could not have conjured up the concept of a perfect being myself. 4. The concept may have originated from the perfect being itself. This is an innate idea. 5. A perfect being must exist to be perfect. And 6. A perfect being exists. This is God. Continuing on from this, the second stage of his argument goes as follows. 1. The idea of God is of a supremely perfect being. 2. A supremely perfect being has all perfections. 3. Existence is a predicate of a perfect being. 4. Therefore God must exist to avoid being self-contradictory. Norman Malcolm was another scholar in favour of the ontological argument. He reformulated and developed Anselm's argument. He argued that necessary existence is either impossible or necessary. God must therefore be impossible or necessary. God's existence is only impossible if the concept of God is self-contradictory. The concept of God is not self-contradictory, therefore not impossible. Thus, God is necessary, thus God exists. Criticisms of the ontological argument. Aquinas. Aquinas argued that we do not really know what God means. We cannot say that existence is a predicate of his nature. God's existence is not analytical, we must have experience. David Hume. Hume argued that if something is thought of as existing, it can also be thought of as not existing. All existential propositions are therefore synthetic or experienced, not analytical.